the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're well. Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show. I am your host. My name is Jerome, and I call myself the Sane Environmentalist. You can catch me on YouTube. I guess you can find me on Facebook, too, if you do some searching around. At any rate, today is the 2nd of May, 2018. It is a blue sky day in Eugene, Oregon. We'll have to see how the day turns up there. You can never tell here one way or the other really what the weather's going to do. But they do say that it gets better in May. It stays gray till May, so maybe we'll see some blue skies in the upcoming weeks. So today, this week, my focus is going to be on the Hanford site and on the Columbia Generating Station as well. Tomorrow, I have an interview with a lady named Nancy Newell. Nancy is a person who is very active in the nuclear industry and has much knowledge about the Columbia Generating Station, and should be able to fill us in quite a bit about some of the details of the Columbia Generating Station, which is located right on the Hanford site, within, I would say, 10 miles of the old facilities where they did all the processing and stuff. So, went to the NRC's site here, and I was looking up for any nuclear incidents, and I don't see any. Let's see if I can find it. They have a tendency to like to hide things in plain sight. Yeah, let's see. News releases. Gosh, nothing. There's just a whole bunch of empty pages. Isn't that interesting? Here we go, 2018 news releases. So it looks like the NRC is to conduct an open house to discuss the 2017 performance of the Braidwood nuclear power plant, which is probably another one of those failing plants. And they named a resident inspector at the Indian Point plant as well on the 1st. Last month, they launched a special investigation at the Watts Bar nuclear plant. They increased the power output. They approved a power increase for the Hope generating station. And they're looking for comment on the environmental impacts for the Clinch River Early site. So yeah, they're still trying to build these things, new ones, somehow thinking it's going to be a viable thing. It is not a viable thing. I recommend all my readers check out, I believe it's a Seattle area organization, but it's called, or California, but it's called King 5 News. And if you Google King 5 News, Hanford's Dirty Secrets, you'll come up with a series of videos. They're on YouTube. One person actually stuck them all together, and it's altogether about a 45-minute presentation. And some of the things that have gone on at the Hanford site, some of the wastes, some of the, my God, the waste, the tanks at Hanford, which now we have confirmed one double shell tank is leaking, and many of the single shell tanks are also leaking. There has been thousands and thousands of gallons of highly radioactive sludge, I'm going to call it. It's that yellow. Do another Google image search for Hanford tank leak, and you'll find pictures of this stuff. It looks evil, like a yellow, crusty, I'm not sure what to call it, but it's plutonium and americium and cesium and strontium mostly. It's all the metals that have fallen out of solution in those big tanks. And they do, even though they agitate the tanks, they will still have a tendency to want to stratify over time. You know, as one little chunk hooks to another little chunk, and then you get some bigger chunks, and then one of those will stick to a wall somewhere, and then another one will stick to that, and then before long you've got layers. And the heaviest stuff ends up at the bottom of the tank. The heaviest stuff in this situation is strontium, cesium, plutonium, uranium. So that's what's in the bottom. Probably no less than meter or 2 meters of those tanks is basically just a metal paste, sludge paste. Very dense, very heavy, very caustic and acidic. Super corrosive to any kind of metal. Lordy Lord, what were they thinking? You know, when they put 1 million gallons of liquid into this thing, and with the 20-year, okay, here's the trick with the tanks at Hanford. They were rated for a 20-year life, and indeed, for 20 years, those things did fantastic. However, it's been no less than, 50, 60 years since some of those tanks started getting filled, and there's been no effort, apparently, on behalf of the United States government to clean up that mess. The United States government, their idea of cleanup is to contract some organization to do the cleanup for them, and then that way it removes the government from accountability by the people and makes the organization or corporation, which, oh, by the way, is protected, accountable. You know, CHN2, Hill, there's a bunch of different companies which do this sort of remediation, they call it. You know, all the people that did the Rocky Flats site, where they just literally barely covered over all the waste out there. You know, and got a big bonus. just like the guys that are trying to do the tank farms and the plutonium processing facility at Hanford are looking forward to a big bonus, because they're like, well, if we can tear this thing down ahead of schedule, then there's a 51 million on the plutonium finishing plant. There's a $51 million bonus that the government will give them if they can complete the work early. So the government creates the mess. The Department of Energy and the Department of Defense create the mess, haphazardly, willy-nilly, pumping millions of gallons of liquid into these tanks, and then just leaving it there until people finally start raising hell and they start leaking, and then they get somebody to clean it up. So I'm going to read from the Hanford.gov website. Okay, this is their explanation, if you will, of what the tank farms are. After irradiated fuel rods were taken from the nuclear reactors to the processing facilities at Hanford, they were exposed to a series of chemical processes designed to dissolve away the fuel rod itself, allowing workers to retrieve the plutonium. As you may imagine, the chemicals needed for dissolving away the metal of the fuel rods were powerful. At the same time, once those chemicals were exposed to the irradiated fuel rods, the chemicals needed to dissolve the metal became radioactive and extremely hot. They also couldn't be used over and over again. Whenever a new batch of irradiated fuel rods was delivered to the process canyons, so these chemicals became a waste byproduct of producing plutonium and had to be disposed of. Additionally, following their use inside the processing facilities, the chemicals were caustic and extremely hazardous to humans and the environment. They couldn't be poured into the ground or into the Columbia River. Early Hanford scientists understood that these chemicals and radioactive wastes could be hazardous to both people and the environment. They decided to build a series of massive underground storage tanks, ranging in capacity from 55,000 gallons to more than 1 million gallons, to hold these wastes. Scientists believe that the tanks would only be used temporarily until a permanent place to dispose of the waste was identified. Still, they required that the early tanks be constructed with robust materials consisting of carbon steel surrounded by reinforced concrete. This proved to be a fortunate decision, since many of the tanks remain in use to this day. No new waste from plutonium production has been added to the tanks in many years, but some of the waste that was originally put in them is still there. After the chemicals needed for plutonium processing had been used, they were put into these storage tanks that were constructed throughout Hanford's 200 area, a series of groups called tank farms. 18 groups of tank farms, some numbering as few as 2 tanks, others up to 16, were located near the processing facilities where these kinds of liquid waste were generated. As the irradiated fuel rods went through the processing canyons, the chemicals needed to dissolve away the fuel rods were routed from the processing facility into these storage tanks. 149 of these single-shell tanks were built at Hanford between 1943 and 1964. 83 single-shell tanks are located in the 200 West area, with another 66 single-shell tanks found in the 200 East area. However, even with 149 tanks available, the volume of chemical waste generated through the plutonium production mission they call it, far exceeded the capacity of the tanks. Some of the liquid waste did not end up being put into holding facilities, and some was poured into open trenches. Some of the waste that were put into the tanks didn't stay there, as the heat generated by the waste and the composition of the waste caused an estimated 67 of these tanks to leak some of their contents into the ground. Some of this liquid waste migrated through the ground and has reached groundwater. Between 1968 and 1986, Hanford engineers built another 28 tanks to be used on the site. These tanks were sturdier, made with a second shell to surround the carbon steel and the reinforced concrete, called double shell tanks. There are 3 double shell tanks in the 200 West area, with another 25 of them in the 200 East area. The materials inside the tanks consist of liquids, gases, semi-solids, and solids. All of the liquid that can be safely pumped out of a single shell tanks and transferred into double shell tanks has taken place. Now work centers on transferring the solid and semi-solid waste into double shell models. Crews continuing to search for new technologies which can facilitate the removal of these semi-solid wastes and get them out of the storage tanks. This is required since the original pumps inside these tanks were designed to remove only liquid waste. What's left inside the tanks today are salt cakes, a material with the consistency of wet beach sand, and sludges. Also inside are wastes that resemble peanut butter, small broken icebergs, foam, or whitish crystals. None of these wastes are easily removed. Adding to the challenge is the fact that access to the materials inside the waste tanks is through long, typically skinny pipes extending out of the tanks. It is through these pipes that crews are forced to send machines and devices into the tanks, which are designed to break up the waste or push the waste around. Because the pipes weren't expected to be needed in this way, the diameter of many of the pipes is small, only about a foot wide. Scientists and engineers have had to develop and then build machines that were small enough to get through that narrow pipe, but also strong enough to withstand the high temperatures and caustic conditions inside the tank. It is also a requirement that the machines be powerful enough to break up the solid waste that they encounter, and strong enough to force the waste into parts of the tank where it can be pumped out. Currently, engineers are evaluating cutting a large opening in the top of the tanks to install more effective, robust retrieval system. As part of the agreement regulating Hanford cleanup, called the Tri-Party Agreement, crews must remove at least 99% of the material at every tank on the Hanford site, or at least as much waste that can be removed on available technology. The final process associated with tank farm waste is at the waste treatment plant, also known as the vitrification plant. Waste from tank farms throughout the site will be pumped into a mammoth waste treatment complex where it will be treated and characterized as low-activity waste or high-level waste based on the waste's composition. The waste will then be processed into glass-forming materials and bonded together in a process called vitrification. Vitrification locks the waste into a more stable glass form. Once the waste has been vitrified, it will be put into steel canisters and safely dispositioned. So that's Hanford's tank story, and they're sticking with it. I almost can't believe that they admitted that 200 tanks are leaking. Many of them are leaking. They were pouring this stuff into open trenches, and it's kind of hard to get an idea of the scale that we're talking about here. But, I mean, they've literally built tons of tanks and filled them all up. And then we got yet another run coming through, You can't stop the process, got to keep making plutonium. What in the world, people, do we need thousands of tons of plutonium for? I mean, has anybody ever thought about that? It takes, I would say, approximately 10 kilograms to make a thermonuclear weapon, maybe 12. Okay, and you might lose a few grams of that over a period of 4 or 5 years. The metallurgy in those triggers will change, and you'll have to pop them out and add new plutonium again. But what in the world? We got enough plutonium to make a million nuclear weapons, and yet we're still processing plutonium. We're still irradiating fuel just for the plutonium. That's one thing that the Columbia River Generating Station is doing. Part of their mission is to work for the Department of Energy to create irradiated fuel so that they can put it through this canyon and dissolve it, just like this, in the same process with the same chemicals. Basically what they do is once they get the fuel rods pop out of the back of these reactors and plop into water, and they have to let them sit there for quite a while. And then finally they cool down, and then they can pull them out, and they dump them in acid and just dissolve away. I think they might have one batch of acid where they just dissolve away the Zirc alloy cladding, and then another batch. I think there's 3 or 4 different batches, and the way they do it is they have these big, long buildings, and inside these buildings are these big tanks, and these tanks are full of these acids, and they work in a step-by-step process. That's why they call it a canyon. It goes from one tank to the next, to the next, to the next, dissolving and purifying and extracting the plutonium from the rest of the junk. And the rest of the junk, okay, we're talking, probably there is some uranium that they are able to recover as well, but probably, most likely, it was mostly just plutonium and just about everything else. And that includes all of the fission products, byproducts, like strontium and cesium, iodine, tritium, deuterium, plutonium, uranium, different isotopes of plutonium, because they didn't get it all. All in that waste. It's a sludge. It was probably like a consistency of almost gravy by the time they were done with it. And they would just pump that stuff into tanks, and it was not only chemically hot, but thermally active and hot. The stuff, plutonium produces heat just by itself. It's almost hard to believe that there is something in the universe that would burn you no matter how long you let it cool down. You could keep it in water for years. If you had a 1 gram cube of plutonium, you could keep it in water for years and pull it out of the water, and it would instantly dry off and fizzle because it was so hot, and you could burn yourself on it, temperature-wise. I believe plutonium glows orange naturally. That's how much energy, heat energy, it produces. And the same thing for strontium and cesium. Those are all highly radioactive products, and things that are highly radioactive are spitting off bits and pieces, and those bits and pieces create friction, and that's what causes the heat. So, and speaking of bits and pieces, I learned an interesting thing this week about radiation, that it's ironic that alpha radiation, which is basically an electron that is stripped off of an atom when it fissions. Basically, this electron, even a piece of paper will stop it. No, it doesn't take much to stop an alpha particle, unless it's a super high energy one, like a cosmic alpha particle. But from a regular transuranic reaction, they're fairly energetic, but a piece of paper will stop them. If you get them internally, you get an alpha emitter internally, there's a difference. It's apparently your skin is a decent barrier against alpha. However, if you have a cut, it'll go right in through the cut. If you ingest it into your body, the way that some of these Hanford guys did with plutonium, then it will really do a lot of damage. It'll do way more damage than either beta or even gamma does. Okay, beta and gamma. An alpha particle is a helium nucleus with no electrons. It gets spit off. It's a proton and a neutron. Beta and gamma are both loose electrons. A neutron is a different thing altogether, so neutron radiation makes other things radioactive, whereas gamma and beta are the more penetrating ones, and alpha is an almost non-penetrating one. But alpha does way more damage, orders of magnitude more damage, as it passes through a material. An alpha particle will interact with 1 in 10 atoms that it passes through. Every 1 in 10 atoms will get damaged by this alpha particle until it finally stops. With gamma and beta, it's 1 in 3,000. So a gamma ray will go right through you, and it will interact with 1 in 3,000 atoms that it goes through, whereas an alpha particle will produce damage to 1 in 10. So you can do the math from that and realize that alpha is the worst, most damaging radiation to living tissue. Thank God that it can't penetrate our skin, because it's all over the place. So the tank farms, there's no solution. The vitrification plant isn't even built yet. They're just testing the technology. They don't know what to do with this stuff. It's leaking into the ground. And growing and developing, no doubt. And they've got tons of solids at the bottoms of these tanks. All the metals and stuff turned into solids, that wet sand effect. I was looking at some pictures from the inside of those tanks, the couple that they've gotten, and they are horrifying looking inside, and they're huge. Horrifying. Like a human would die instantly if a human was exposed to the atmosphere inside of those tanks. You wouldn't even live 10 seconds, I don't think. It would kill you that quickly. If you got that stuff splashed on you, it would eat your skin right to the bone almost immediately. It would dissolve you the same way it dissolved the metal, and then you would die from the poison. Hydrofluoric acid is All right. Sorry, folks. I got bumped off of Skype again. Funny how that works, right? So then they would take the plutonium liquid over to this other area, to the plutonium finishing plant. This is where they actually finish the plutonium metal. And yeah, that's right. I was talking about nuclear triggers, how it's a very delicate and precise thing that you got to do there. That's why it was so hard to figure out. And so you end up with a lot of little bits and scrap and dust, just like in any machine shop. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a machine shop. If you've been in one, or if you ever have the opportunity to go into one, just look around, and everywhere you look, you see this grime. It's basically powderized metal that has, a lot of it has little bits of oil, machining oil on it, which has gotten into the air and stuck to everything. And in any machine shop, you really can't avoid that. I don't know how you could avoid it. If you're working with plutonium metal, you're going to get the same effect. I guess the glove box will protect against, that's, it'll stay at least in the glove box. But what happened is they did that for 40 years or something. They were out there. Imagine in 40 years how much dust you would accumulate and build up. And they didn't really give a darn about efficiency or anything. They were thinking, well, if we waste some plutonium, whatever. We got lots of plutonium. We got tons of plutonium and more coming down the line. Get them out. Get them out. There's so many nuclear triggers. Like, I just don't get it. I don't understand it. That's too many triggers for the number of weapons we have. And we know you can't stockpile triggers. You got to make new ones. You got to go through the whole process again of getting the metal again in a molten form, and then messing with the metallurgy until you get the mix exactly perfect, and then once again casting it, machining it, turning it again back into a trigger, where it goes back into a thermonuclear device. So this plutonium fission finishing plant, I've got an interesting Wikipedia article. What's going on here? I wish I could understand exactly what my phone was doing, because oftentimes it seems like it's just out of whack. I'm assuming I'm online still, so I'm just going to continue. The plant began operation in 1949, and it had the purpose of on-site production of plutonium metal in the form of that was suitable for weapons. It also participated in the programs to recycle plutonium. One of the projects was the use of mixed plutonium oxide uranium oxide fuel in the fast flux test facility. For that project, one of the plutonium finishing plant's tasks was to perform quality assurance for the fuel pins that had been constructed for the fast flux test facility by outside vendors such as Kerr McGee and Numek and Babcock and Wilcox. The major activities at the plutonium finishing plant included creating plutonium buttons used to make weapons. They did that until 1989. Special nuclear material handling and storage, plutonium recovery, plutonium conversion, laboratory support, which is the metallurgy department, waste handling, which is dump it in a ditch, and shut down an operational facility surveillance. They had two lines, a remote A line, remote mechanical A line, and created plutonium oxide powder, and a remote mechanical C line which created metallic plutonium from plutonium nitrate. There was also a plutonium reclamation facility there, and it produced high purity plutonium nitrate solution from a variety of feed sources, including some of the scrap that they had generated as a part of the machining process. The waste treatment facility neutralized liquid nuclear waste before it was pumped to the tank farms. There was an incinerator on site that burned clothes, filters, etc. to recover plutonium residue. Ho, ho, ho. Ventilation systems, nuclear storage vaults, chemical storage, office space, backup generator, etc. And then there was the recouplex process, plutonium recovery and recycle, and that contaminated the ground with plutonium, carbon tetrachloride, and acidic wastes. Cleanup and demolition. Before the last 4 major facilities at the plant could be demolished, approximately 20 years of work was completed to stabilize approximately 20 tons. That's a plutonium-bearing material. Remove legacy plutonium from plant systems, ship all weapons-grade plutonium out of the plant to the Savannah River site, remove 238 pieces of contaminated equipment, including glove boxes and fume hoods, and approximately 50 plutonium processing tanks. And also demolish numerous plant support facilities. These included a vault complex used for secure storage of plutonium. That preparatory work has been called the most hazardous cleanup work at the Hanford site. And the plutonium finishing plant has been called Hanford's most hazardous building. Kind of hard to believe, isn't it? The Department of Energy's plutonium finishing plant closure project intends to have the entire facility cleaned and destroyed down to a concrete slab in 2017. Guess what? DOE, with all contaminated materials moved to other sites. Open-air demolition of the plant's last 4 remaining major facilities began in 2016 on the plant's plutonium reclamation facility. Demolition of a second major facility, the americium recovery facility, also known as the McCluskey Room, because of a fatal accident in 1976, began in January 2017 and was completed in March 2017. Demolition of the third remaining major facility, the ventilation stack and fan houses, was completed in July 2017. Demolition of the last 4 remaining facilities, the main processing facility, began in July of 2017, and as of December, all demolition is on hold after contamination was found as far away as 10 miles from the site and found in 2 car air filters that were checked by the Hanford contractor and deemed clean, and then rechecked by an independent lab and found to have small amounts of radioactive contamination. So it's just a hot mess. You know, go to Google Earth and go to the Hanford site, and it's in the west part of the complex, I believe. But there's you can see all the tank farms and but you can tell the plutonium finishing plant because it's like an L with half or a V with one part lopped off. But they got it about, I would say, a quarter of the way done as far as the actual demolition of the structure itself. And they had to stop because they couldn't contain the plutonium. That dust that I was referring to, that in any machine shop, any any place where you're working with literally tons of material, you're going to end up with some of that material just out and about. It's going to escape. And if that material happens to be plutonium, well, that can be a problem. It really can. So, yeah, they were sending a plume of plutonium particles as far as 10 miles downwind. 30 of the workers that were working on that project tested positive for internal plutonium ingestion. What that means is if you ingest plutonium internally, it goes to your bones. It doesn't want to leave the body, okay? And you're stuck with it. I think that the what do they call it? The biological half-life of plutonium is like 20 years. So whatever you ingest, you're gonna get half of it out of your body in 20 years. And in 20 years, any amount of a few thousand atoms of plutonium is enough to do some damage. And it degrades into stuff that's just as nasty as it is that continues to produce alpha particles. Basically, plutonium is matter that doesn't want to exist, and it's trying to break itself down as quickly as possible because we've created it artificially. I suppose plutonium probably exists in trace quantities in stars and other astral phenomenon. Probably there's some of every element out there. Like some of the heavier elements, you would literally have to they only live for tiny amounts of time before they destroy themselves. Anything above, I don't know, 90 or so on the table of a periodic table is going to be pretty nasty once you enrich it. So, folks, I don't know what we can do about this. They basically got a hot mess out there at the plutonium finishing plant. We've got tanks that are leaking that they really can't pump out because of the solid components in them. And no technology exists for going down in there and scooping up the solid material. And if they're able to scoop it up, what then do you do with it? Okay, you got this dripping wet, highly caustic, metallic sludge, let's call it that. In the lower 6 to 8 feet of those tanks, every single one of them is just a solid layer of it. Thousands of tons of strontium, cesium, etc. Thousands of tons, enough to kill the entire living population of the planet. And just the one tank out, the one double shell that's leaking, has that much radiation in it. It could kill every living creature on this planet. That's how much evil we've created. We've created 100 and how many tanks? So many. 168, is that it? 83, 149, so over 240 tanks full of this stuff. And what are we going to do? Transuranic waste treatment and clarification. Transuranic waste consists of waste that is contaminated with man-made radioactive elements which are heavier than uranium, meaning the elements have a higher atomic number than uranium on the periodic table of elements. Because they come after uranium on the periodic table, they are referred to as transuranic. The concentration of these transuranic elements in the waste determines whether it's transuranic or not. Oh, really? More than 70,000 containers of this waste, sometimes referred to as suspect TRU waste, was stored under a layer of dirt in the 70s and 80s in the 200 area in Hanford. Low-level burial grounds at Hanford were, the intention was to retrieve it, which is why sometimes it is also referred to as retrievably stored waste, at a later date when the National Repository was established to accept this waste. And this is some of the waste that they used the bad kitty litter on it, and it exploded at the whip. This is that same waste. Lord of mercy, folks. Lord of mercy. What have we done? And again, I think I do go back to this literally every week. In the name of our own safety, we have ensured the destruction of everything. You know, in order to protect ourselves from each other, humanity, we have created enough poison to kill everybody and everything. You know, it's silly. It's silly. It's inhumane. It really is. It should be inhumane. You know, what we're doing with the whole approach, putting it out there. You know, that's my new thing these days. Is I'd like to tell people, you know, don't even put that out there. Because if you put it out there, then that makes it a possibility. You could create things by putting them out there. So they're creating the possibility for nuclear war, possibility for man to utterly and completely annihilate himself as a guarantee of our safety. So we live in constant terror as a species. We really do. It's an underlying terror. It's an underlying fear. It's one that we've had to learn to ignore, folks. We've had to learn to ignore that fear and go, well, there's nothing I can do about it. You know, and apparently there is nothing we can do about it. You know, why aren't there 100 people at the Hanford gate every day screaming and hollering? Why isn't the news media covering this? You know, why can I only find one organization, King 5 News, that is willing to cover that? And they're pretty mainstream. I was talking to Lonnie about that yesterday, and she said that somebody has to talk about it. And even though King 5 is part of the mainstream media, somebody's got to talk about it to keep the people complacent. So that somehow we think they got this. Well, they got this, all right. They're not very good at it. There's, I'm just kind of at a lack of words there, you know. It'll be interesting to interview Miss Dugan about that, you know, and Ms. Newell about that. You know, if it's good to get a second perspective on these things, but I can say this for sure. If the Columbia Generating Station has a catastrophic event, and let's say suffers a breach or some sort of partial core meltdown, and irradiates the area around it, a radiated area will include the Hanford tank farms. And you may be thinking, well, so what? It's already as radioactive as it can get right there. Indeed it is. Very radioactive. However, people have to go there and they have to manage it. They have to be there probably 24 hours a day to make sure those tanks continue to get stirred and maintained, and there's processes, and they're moving liquids from one tank to another tank, and that has to be constantly monitored, because we're not, again, dealing with motor oil here. We're dealing with something that's incredibly toxic and unpredictable. You don't know from 1 second to the next, is you going to get a chunk of sludge that'll block a line? I mean, think about it. The sludge will do the same thing inside the hoses that it does inside the tanks. It'll build up, it'll stick to the side, and pretty soon you'll have that cake effect, and it'll literally block the line. And furthermore, any piece of equipment that either pumps, moves, manipulates, stirs, or moves this stuff is going to become very radioactive itself, to the point where it won't be able to be approached by humans anymore. It itself will become high-level radioactive waste. You know, all the equipment, all the tools, all the clothes, all the booties, all the gloves, it all gets contaminated. Radioactivity and the radioactive elements have a certain insidious nature about them, where they don't do the simplest thing. It seems like they always go and do the worst thing that they can do. You know, how did that get there? How did a microscopic specks of plutonium get all the way from the plutonium finishing plant to 10 miles away? You know, I don't know. There's some video of them doing the partial teardown there, and I looked at the video, and I know what that building is, okay? And you could see the blue, it's an anti-radiation foam that's supposed to stop dust. But it doesn't. As soon as those big chunks of concrete go boom and fall 40 feet and hit the ground, I don't care how much water you're spraying on them, they're going to kick up a big pile of dust. And when they do, that dust is going to have a percentage of plutonium, just like everything in that building has a percentage of plutonium. You know, and that gets into the air and flows downstream, and there again, you know, that little chunk of plutonium could end up, you know, being inhaled by somebody's child in Portland, Oregon. You know, it could get into the Columbia River, make its way from the Columbia River to the Willamette River, all the way down here to Eugene, splash up on a rock, dry up, and then go airborne again, and I could inhale it. And it doesn't take much. It takes one speck of this stuff, and they've got millions of pounds of it. But yeah, I remember watching that when they would spray it, and they had some kind of weird mister thing, and they get up there with a crane, a big, I don't know, a bucket loader, you know, it's got the long hook on it that grabs on and pulls chunks off, and they're just huge clouds of dust, despite the spraying, despite the misting. There's just huge clouds of dust coming off of that. And I'm like, that doesn't look like it's going to work real well to me. Looks like they're being in a hurry. You know, what they were thinking is go inside, get all the glove boxes out, and then just spray the thing with foam, knock it down real quick, and then you'll just have a concrete pad. That's what they were thinking. You know, they didn't take into mind that the wind patterns, any of that, they did the least that they could possibly do. Okay, that facility needs another larger facility constructed over it. That even a portable facility that is modular, that you could just smack together, that's somewhat completely dust proof. You know, and you get in there, and then you break the thing apart, use robots to maneuver the stuff and to encapsulate it. You know, and then you can basically tear down your now radioactive outer shell, and then that's now radioactive waste too. So, but it's not 10 miles downwind. Okay, it's contained. That's all that we really have with this stuff. Is now it is all about containment. You know, because once it exists, once radioactivity and transuranic elements exist, they exist. There's no way to get rid of them that we know of. And so we just have to wait for them to decay into non-transuranic elements. And in some cases, like plutonium, for instance, that takes a long, long time. Like 240, a quarter of a million years is how long it takes for plutonium to go away. You can call it 10 half-lives, and it's a 24,000 year half-life, so about a quarter of a million years. A chunk of plutonium would turn into the next step down, which I believe is, I'm not positive, I believe it's americium, perhaps. Let's see. All the way down here. Plutonium, up and over. Promethium-145. Or if it just went back one, it would be neptunium with an atomic weight of 93. So, plutonium, let's see, neptunium. I don't know if we can get a half-life on this. It's an actinide. And I'm looking for energy density. 56,000 kilojoules. I almost can't believe they don't have the half-life. Oh, here we go. 396.1 days. Oh, here's one. Neptunium 237. 2,000 times 10. 6 years. That's the current time. That's a decay is, let's see, 239. 2.41 times 10 to the 4th. Great. But anyway,